biology is about 100,000 times more complicated than electrical engineering, and I am not kidding. A teaspoon of bacteria is more sophisticated than a building full of Google engineers. Michael Levin at Tufts University has done experiments where he induces cancer in amphibians and then gets cancer cells to revert back to normal cells. Yes, most people are not conscious enough of their own gifts, their own abilities, the things that they innately do without even trying or without even thinking about it. Sometimes you need to challenge authority, and sometimes it's a very rough road.
So, Perry, many people know you for so many different things. In fact, if you're watching right now, you probably know this man for a multitude of different reasons. You are a complete renegade. You have taken things like 80/20 to a completely different level, where most people have heard of that concept. You've applied it to like the very inner beings of everyone's souls. You've started off being a marketer. You were there at the very onset of almost all of digital marketing, being a big player in Google advertising and all of that. And now you're at the forefront of one of the most interesting things going on in cancer right now, of not just finding cures, but ways that you can detect it so early on that at some point in the future, maybe 10, 20 years, a average Joe could go to a CVS and find out, hey, do I have cancer? And you could get to work on it and maybe move it down to like the number 5th biggest killer in the world. But we'll probably get to that later because we have to start earlier than that. So I was talking with John here a bit on where on earth do we take this guy, which, by the way, this is the first guest we've ever had 2 pages of notes for, just for everyone to know.
Right.
First guest ever, completely filled up.
Yeah.
So,
and I added more this morning.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. That I don't have on here at
Right.
all.
Yeah.
So, Perry, you have to take me back to the day where you decided, hey, I want to run a conference and give literally every single person a Mac. And tell me what happened.
Rewind the clock.
My first conference was in 2006, and it was a Google advertising conference. It might have been the first Google advertising conference anybody ever did. And I went to my mastermind group, which I would never not be part of a mastermind group. And I said, hey, I'm doing this conference and I want to put butts in seats, and here's what I'm doing. What suggestions do you have? And Dan Kennedy says, well, what do these people want? Like, what kind of things do they want? He said, would you be willing to spend the registration money on marketing to get them in the seat so they could buy more things later? I said, yes. And I said, well, we have this program and the winners of the program get free Mac computers. And he says, well, give them one of those. And one of the guys in the room jumps up and he goes, Apple just came out with a brand new computer. It's called a MacBook Pro, and it's just coming out right now.
Yep.
And give those away. And so everybody's like, Perry, what a great idea. And so, encouraged by all this peer pressure, on the way to the airport, I call the Apple store. I find that the Apple store is completely useless for a question like this. I have to go higher up. Well, eventually, I got to the Midwest regional sales manager of Apple Computer, which was somebody you could probably get a hold of back then.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And he cut me a 13% discount.
Wow.
And he said,
because you were
That's
buying
really
how many?
good.
Because I ended up buying 170.
170?
Yes.
Times how much were they worth at the time?
The list price was 2,000 and I was buying them for like what, 17, 18, whatever that number was. And
Right.
and so this I, this was way beyond anything I had ever done. And the first problem that I had was, so how are you going to pay for these? And like, well,
Yeah.
can I give you a purchase order? No, you cannot give us a purchase order. You have to give us a letter of credit,
Right.
which means that you have put all the money in a bank account.
Yep.
And then when the stuff gets delivered, then the bank will give Apple the money. Well, my bank in Chicago, they said, oh, it's going to take us a month to write you a letter of credit. I have no idea why. I ended up getting Cornhusker Bank in Lincoln, Nebraska to give me a letter of credit because I'm from Lincoln and I knew somebody. And we're off to the races. Well, so I put this out there, and a funny thing happened. I was gonna send a press release, and I mentioned it to the Midwest regional sales manager. He goes, "Do not, no, do not put this above the radar." I go, "Why?" He goes, "Because a major automotive manufacturer tried to do a very similar promotion, and Steve Jobs killed it." He goes, "As long as we can make sure Steve never hears about this, you'll probably be fine. But he's really touchy about his brand and other
Oh,
brands."
right, exactly.
And
Right.
he just doesn't like that sort of thing. So no, don't do a press release. So but I had the coolest seminar offer ever, which was come to a $2,000 seminar, get a $2,000 MacBook Pro free.
Right, exactly.
And so I had a problem, which, well, first, as I collected the money, I had to transfer the money to Cornhusker Bank and like keep this thing going. This turned out to be popular and people are signing up for it. And I'm hoping and praying that they actually deliver them on time like they promised they would. And one day I got a call from the director of operations at Apple, and he said, "Perry, I've got good news and bad news for you." And I'm like, "Oh, don't you screw me over." And he goes, "The good news is your computers are on a plane from Shanghai right as I speak. They're on their way to the United States." He goes, "The bad news is I don't know where to ship them."
Exactly.
I had never
Oh,
even
yeah.
thought about this. And
Oh my
like,
God.
where do you put
$170
$300,000 of computers? Now, at the time, my house was probably worth 170 and not paid for. And I have all these computers that I have paid for with all this money from these seminar people. And what am I going to do? Well, I would never put them in my basement. What if somebody broke in?
Right.
Yep.
I called a friend who worked at a warehouse. They would do it if I like gave them a lot of money, but I didn't want to give them a lot of money. And we dithered about this for a while. And finally, the Apple guy got the shipping company to just hang on to them until the delivery day. So finally the delivery day comes, which is the day before the seminar. So we go
And
to
the seminar's in Chicago, right?
It's in Chicago. It's the Hyatt Regency O'Hare.
Okay.
Oh, here's another problem. After we announced the computer promotion, our registration spiked, but then the hotel sold out. And it wasn't just us, it was some other conferences.
Yeah.
And so now my registration kept climbing, but I could not offset my meeting room costs with
Oh, right.
with rooms.
Mm.
And then they said, fire code says that we have to move you to a bigger room, and that costs $15,000. And we don't have any rooms that we can sell you to offset it.
Right.
So, so I had to pay them $15,000, which they allowed me to do it with food and beverage, which is why we had an extra reception. So not only did they get their MacBook Pro computers and a perfectly great seminar,
Right.
but they also got a reception with chicken and wine and, snacks and stuff. Well,
So that's why, so if anyone went to that, they're like, that's why there was one.
Yeah, that's the reason why. Nobody asks questions like this. Why was there an extra receipt?
All right, if anyone listening someday was there right now, I need you to write in immediately and let us know who you are.
Well, the really interesting part was the day before when the delivery truck came with all the computers. It had pallets of these MacBook Pros.
Wow.
And they're beautiful.
So you're feeling like the biggest Apple fanboy ever right now.
And so the truck delivered them all, and they put them in this room, and then the hotel manager brought me a clipboard and asked me to sign it. And what the clipboard said was, Hyatt Regency Hotel assumes no responsibility
Right.
for the property in this room. And I said, I'm not signing this.
Yep.
And then they say, oh, but it's safe. If it's safe, you won't make me sign it. Like, it was a total skin in the game argument.
Right.
And we are having a standoff with the hotel management over these computers.
Right.
And I call my meeting planner, and she gets on the phone and she cusses them out and reads them the riot act. And I do millions of dollars of business with you, and you won't. And legal has already gone home on the East Coast, and so we can't get a hold of them. Finally, the hotel manager writes me a letter on hotel letterhead. It says the only people with the key are the director of security and you. We've never had a security incident. If we have a security incident, we will notify, Prudential Insurance, like all this.
Right.
I'm like, well, this is as good as I'm going to get. And so I signed it, and we put them in a room. And then the next day, everybody showed up, and they got their computers. And that was my baptism of fire. That was my first seminar. We had three.
That was your first?
That was my first seminar. I had never organized a seminar before.
That's when you say he has stones.
There were so many moving parts to this thing, and we had the audio video crew. People have no idea when you haven't done a seminar. They have no idea how much scurrying around is going on behind with getting the speakers lined up, and did the person show up, and is their PowerPoint presentation loaded in, and is the audio video, do they have their microphone and all that. And I remember walking through this crowded hotel lobby, and like everybody wants to say hi to me, and I just remember thinking, oh, I wish I was just home reading a philosophy book. This is so intense. Like I just want to go home. And then there's another part about that seminar, if that wasn't enough. So first session of the seminar, everybody's got their computers. They're sitting there with the computers on their laptops, and they're, oh man, this is really cool. I have a guy who came from Apple as a favor to us to explain. It's like he's from the Chicago office or something.
Nice.
And he's explaining GarageBand and all these things, and everybody's all happy. And I'm in the hallway, and this guy comes up to me and he goes, I got a bone to pick with you. He goes, I signed up for this before you had the computer. I didn't pay the extra $500 for the computer. And now there's an Apple commercial at my seminar. I want to know what you're going to do about it. And I should have sent him home and give him a refund, but I didn't. And I worked out some deal where one of my consultants would do a session with them and make him happy. Well, Sunday morning, I decided I'm going to do a Sunday morning spiritual talk before the full seminar starts.
I remember this.
So Saturday, I announced 2 different times. I said, tomorrow the seminar starts at 9. I'm doing an optional spiritual session at 8. If you're into that, come. And if you're not, stay at home and watch Gilligan's Island and come at 9. And so, okay. So I felt like I wanted to add a spiritual ingredient because that's part of my beliefs. And I think there's not enough discussion about these kind of things in the world. And so I tossed and turned all night. I had a premonition that it was, I don't know, something would go wrong. But anyway, 8 o'clock, half the audience shows up. So I got 150 people. I give my talk. I'm about 45 minutes in, and the same guy
Oh no.
that complained about the Apple computers stood up and he goes, "This is an outrage. I paid good money to come to a Google AdWords seminar, and this is Sunday school."
That is amazing.
And
Oh my
I
God.
heard a little voice inside my head say, "Be quiet." And I stood there and I looked at him and I took my bottle of water, and the seconds dragged by, and all of a sudden, all at once, the audience erupted and people said, "It was optional."
Yep.
Finish your story, Perry.
Yep.
And I finished my story, and then the session was over. And the rest of the day, I got nothing but respect.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing.
Yep.
In fact, I went to a breakout session in the afternoon. It must have been 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And I was giving a talk for people that were interested in that. And I was sitting on the stage bantering with some people who came before I got started. And people filtered in, and now there's like 30 people in the room and they're scattered all over the place. And I said, "Okay, it's 3 o'clock, let's get started." And everybody in the room moved to the front row. I've never seen that happen anywhere.
Right.
I didn't tell them to. They just all said, "All right, ready, at attention." And I did my session. And so that was my first seminar.
People really respect when someone does not back down on something that they did or said.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to do, even if everyone always tells you that that's how it's going to be, right? There's always like one loud person for every 100 people that probably are totally fine and
Yeah.
want to hear more.
Well, I had people come up to me and say, "Hey, I'm not a Christian like you. I'm a Buddhist, but I really respect you doing that."
Yeah.
Well, they do. And it doesn't offend them in the slightest.
Right.
Everybody knows I have different beliefs than them,
Right.
but everybody's afraid to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And they appreciate it. So I've always incorporated some kind of ingredient like that in my events. You know, sometimes I have prophetic people there, or like we do it all kinds of different ways. There's not
Yep.
a formula, but
Right.
I get very, very little pushback on that, and we don't overdo it.
Oh yeah.
We don't.
It's respectful.
We don't ram anything down anybody's throats.
Right.
In fact, I think almost everything I do, because this extends into the science work, I think all of it is a demilitarized zone. And I think all of it is what I call a seeker group.
Mm-hmm.
What do I mean by a seeker group? Well, when I used to go to a mega church in Chicago, and we had this thing called a seeker small group. And a seeker small group was a Bible study for people who most definitely do not necessarily believe the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And it was designed for people that were not from church backgrounds, and they may be a Buddhist or an agnostic or a burned out Catholic or a Hindu or
Sure.
anything. And it's totally different than running a Bible study, because at a Bible study, everybody's like
Yeah.
theoretically on the same
They know
page.
where to find Genesis.
But these, there was
Yeah, just
no
open the book.
there was no baked in
Right.
assumption that you agree with any of this.
Mhm.
We're just opening it up, and that was I thought it was exhilarating.
Yeah, that's cool.
And it was dancing on the airplane wing every single time. You never knew what you were going to get. And Megan Macedo said to me, "Oh," I described this to her. She goes, "Well, Planet Perry is a seeker group." Well, yeah, Well, it is. And she said after our last seminar, she goes, I have a few observations to make about your people. She goes, not only do your audience tend to be people who have had several failure cycles and they've drank the pink Kool-Aid and now they're over that and they're ready to learn the real stuff. Not
Yeah.
only is that true, I think most of your people are also have had at least one existential crisis.
So they're a normal human being.
Yeah, yeah. But you have to kind of admit to yourself that you're ready to have an existential
yeah.
crisis
No, I agree. Yeah.
instead of shoving it down with alcohol
Yeah.
or cigarettes.
Yep.
And so that's one of the things that I love about it, and it definitely extends into my science work.
Yep.
And it's a more uncomfortable territory. There's a lot more ambiguity.
Yep.
And you need a lot more grace for however people are showing up on any given day.
So I got to go back to, where did you get the, since Spanish, some of my buddies like to say, like, the cojones, right? To have the balls to literally go and run some of those things.
Well, I mean,
a lot of people, agree with a lot of things you're saying, but it takes something different to do it.
If I had to put that on one person, it would be my dad.
Mhm.
So my dad was a pastor in a large church. He didn't run the place. He was just one of the pastors. And when I was 12, my mom's mental illness returned. Now, nobody really understood this very well at the time, but she had had a couple of little bouts with mental instability earlier in her life. And this time it was here to stay. And so our family was bedlam for a year and a half. And she was fighting with everybody and she was kind of delusional, but nobody really understood what was going on. And he cast around for a while and he got her to a psychiatrist who correctly diagnosed her as having bipolar with mild schizophrenia. And he put her on medication, which immediately had a positive effect on her. And no sooner did that happen, but he got called into a board of elders meeting and they said, hey, you just took your wife to a psychiatrist. We don't do that around here. And they demoted him and they publicly humiliated all of us. Like the following Sunday, there was an announcement from the pulpit in front of all these people. Well, Bob is having some problems with Betty and the family, and he's stepped down from his position as an elder. And my dad stood his ground. And as my mom went through her process of sorting this out, and she improved, he got in the face of one person in particular. The senior pastor was really behind all of this. And he said, you are wrong. This is not like some rebellion issue or anything like that. This is a medical condition and she's on medication and you owe me an apology, you owe her an apology, and you need to reinstate me because that was wrong. And he was one of the few people that would stand up to a very strong, charismatic leader. And he got his position back.
Wow.
He got an apology letter. And he vindicated himself. And then he got cancer, and then he died a couple years later.
Wow.
And I guess about 3 years, and there were 2,000 people at his funeral.
Dang, wow.
And so I learned early that sometimes you need to challenge authority, and sometimes it's a very rough road. I mean, that was not an easy road.
Yeah.
We felt like pariahs. There were a lot of people that were like, usually when something kind of shameful like that happens, most people will just back off. They don't really know what to think. They know what to say, so they won't really say anything. And then we just felt like pariahs. And there were a few people that really stuck with us and supported us and helped us with things. And you know, we could have bolted. We had relatives that say, like, you should get the hell out of Dodge, man.
Right. Yeah, leave it.
And there are arguments for maybe he should have done that, but he stuck it out. And then when he had a terminal disease and we had medical expenses and all the rest, there was a whole bunch of people around us that were there to support us.
Wow.
So that's real life in a faith community, by the way. It's not all roses and frequent flyer miles and lattes and, you know, whatever. People work out their deepest emotional and spiritual issues with each other in communities, and sometimes those communities are rough places to be.
I want to switch to what I'm going to call the itch. And I think about you because we met such a long time ago. And I'm thinking about Perry Marshall walking in the door at Synergetic Microsystems for an interview, which Mike Justice and I interviewed you for a sales position. And then I learned all sorts of things about you, not just at the interview, but we were talking about you were in the Amway distributor, right? You were an incredible reader and you did a lot of writing. And I remember you were publishing articles like in Chemical Magazine or something like that, right? And then you got into training, right? And so you went from this audiophile speaker design engineer at Jensen, right?
Yeah, like, by the way, these are made by this man. These are all made by this guy.
Design, engineer, everything, right? And and I could go on, but you have this itch about you that just never seems to get scratched, at least not to the satisfaction of, okay, I'm over that, because there seems to always be something about Perry, like, what's Perry doing now?
Well,
what's driving that?
Well, that's very true. I'll have to think for a second to give you a good answer, but let's just start with that interview. So rewind 2 years before that interview, I had been an acoustical engineer. I had a speaker design job, which I had always wanted. I'd been doing that for a couple of years. Then there was a slowdown. I got laid off. My wife was 3 months pregnant.
Right.
I could have gotten an acoustics job out of state, but I didn't want to move out of Chicago again.
While your wife is pregnant.
While my wife is pregnant. And so I went into sales. And
you never carried a bag before either, right?
No. And I had a friend.
What made you even think about sales from being audio engineer? Like, you know, I'm just going to be a sales guy.
Because I was a multi-level marketing distributor.
Oh, there we go.
So I had already been driving all over the place, making appointments, making phone calls, networking with people. And like, that's a whole sordid, sad story that I've told many times. I had gotten, why did I do that? Because I got fired not once, but I got fired 3 times in a row. 1 time for playing a practical joke and 2 times for asking too many questions.
Right. The practical joke is what we were talking about earlier. So we can come back to that one.
Okay. and that really shook my confidence, getting fired from a few jobs and scrambling around. And so, you know, I go to an Amway meeting and they're talking about, you know, there's the 40-year plan, which you can get laid off and, you know, you could be 57 years old and then get fired and then you drive a taxi. And I'm like, I'm relating to this at age 21. Like, that's true.
Right.
And I would have never taken something like that seriously before. But all of a sudden, I was very uncomfortable. I was very agitated. And so I got an Amway and I totally drank the pink Kool-Aid. I believed everything they told me. I went after it for 6 or 7 years. I just relentless, stupidly persistent. But
Really quick, for people my age,
yeah.
talk about, like, just really quick what Amway was.
Okay, so Amway is one of many, many multi-level marketing companies that works like this. I sign up, I buy some stuff, maybe I sell some of it too, but then I sign up you, and then I get a percentage of all your stuff, and you sign up John, and all of us get a percentage of John's stuff, and then John signs up a bunch of people, and on it goes. Right. And in my professional opinion, as a marketing consultant and author and expert on marketing and all the rest, I think somewhere north of 90% of the MLM industry is scams. I think it is one of the most illegitimate industries. There are companies that are for real, that actually have a product, and they're not scamming people, but it is a godforsaken,
there's some passion there. Look at this, man.
Industry.
Right.
It is.
Yeah.
And most people sort of kind of know this. They just don't know why. Part of my story was I had to completely deprogram myself and do an intervention on myself that nobody could do for me. And this was partly because of the internet. In the late 90s, the whole, like, what's wrong with Amway started spewing out on the internet. Before then, you could keep a secret from millions of people.
Yeah.
After the internet, you couldn't do that.
Yeah.
So I spent probably about a year painstakingly sifting truth from fiction. I had lunch meetings with diamonds and ex-diamonds, and I had conversations with lots of people, and I figured it out. I completely deconstructed the whole entire thing to my complete satisfaction. Like,
of course you did. Yeah.
This is true, this is false, this is true, this is false. And I walked away from it. And I've been an anti-advocate ever since. But I had to do that. Well, I was in the middle of that towards closer to the end of that when I met you. So the backstory is, the first sales job that actually worked for me, John hired me. Right. John was a consultant working at that company with a fair amount of authority. John said, Mike, I think you should hire Perry. They hired me. So backing up, I engineer, doing Amway on the side. I get laid off. I don't know. I've met a lot of sales reps. They don't seem to be any smarter than me. I think I'll do this. I remember one friend, he said, Perry, you don't just stick a pencil behind your ear and get into a whole new career just like that. Right. Like this, there might be some complexity to this. Yeah, I'll handle this. And this is another pattern of I jump into things I'll figure this out.
Exactly.
Well, it was 2 years of bologna sandwiches and ramen soup, and baked potatoes and salsa is another good cheap food.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Salsa is really cheap. Potatoes are really cheap. You could eat for a week on $10.
So Mike and I, our background, we're engineers, right? So we're sitting there interviewing, and we're like, this is one of us sitting across the table, right? Yeah. And we knew that you could transition from engineer to sales because we both had done that, right?
Yep.
And I mean, I didn't do any engineering. I graduated from college, and Intel recruited me into sales, and that was it. I never did it. I never engineered anything, right? So you at least had that on me. And so
it was the good Lord's hand that he met you then.
Well, it was a hugely fortuitous thing because I was running on fumes. We were in pretty serious financial situation by then. Yeah. I had a baby at home who was 1.5 years old. My wife had come home from her job. Our credit card debt was going up. Right. I was not usually getting a sales commission from my job.
How old were you at the time?
Was 28, 27. Yeah. 20. So that job was not a good fit for me. I had learned all the things that Synergetic needed me to know by then.
Right.
And it felt right. I remember the job offer came. I took it the weekend before I started work. I just had this feeling in my stomach like this actually feels like it's going to work.
Right.
And it did.
Yeah.
It did. And like props to you for,
Yeah.
because I mean that was the relief I felt when the wolf was suddenly not at the door anymore. Like my first paycheck was the biggest paycheck I'd ever gotten. And I snagged a few sales and I got some
Yeah,
commission
you did great.
and it started to work. It was a sales job that only an engineer could do.
Right.
And that was the key. I
Yeah.
am not a car salesman who slaps you on the back and tells you jokes and tells you how he likes the fish picture on your wall. Like I'm not that guy. And
But go back to the itch, because even at Synergetic, and again, I was a consultant and kind of moving on my own at that point. But from what I know, Synergetic really never did any training, and you started doing training, and the company
oh
wasn't doing any marketing or any PR, right? So you started doing PR. You had never done any PR before.
no,
Start writing articles for these major publications. I mean, you were just doing stuff like no one had ever done before, especially a tiny little company. So there's some kind of, as I say, sort of this itch that's going on in your brain, like I have to scratch that a little bit.
well, I was endlessly curious, and
Mm,
when I when I had that sales rep job, and it was so eh, everything just kept going wrong. I would have a deal that looked like it was going to work out, and then it would not work out, and then another one, and then it wouldn't work out, and then this would just go on and on and on. And so I discovered Dan Kennedy in direct marketing in '97, and I bought this product from him, and
right.
I started studying it, and and then I come to work at Synergetic, who had a website and they had emails and they had a CRM system. And it was the first time I'd had all of that at my disposal. Plus, we were marketing nationwide. Yes, it was a tiny little company with very little resources. But Mike, like me, was left handed. He was open minded. It was like he would say yes to any reasonable request,
Right.
and most people would not. And so it was the right combination of necessity is the mother of invention. I've got my hand in this direct marketing world, and I'm reading the Dan Kennedy newsletters. I'm figuring out on my own that all that stuff from direct mail and print advertising applies directly to internet pages and all of that. We're learning early SEO and we're making it work. And it was thrilling.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, here we got a contact database, we got some faxes that came in, we got some emails from the website coming in every day. Call these people and figure out how to. I recruited a sales channel, I got reps, I got distributors, I knew enough. Like my scars from being a rep, I would listen to my boss schmoozing the manufacturers to keep them on board,
Mm-hmm.
and then like working both sides of the equation. And I would go see a rep and I would say, you know what the biggest problem in your life is you spend 18 or 24 months building a huge account, you get the order, and then they go direct and they cut you out. That's your biggest problem. They're like, yes,
Right.
Yep.
yeah. Like, yeah, I know this because I was a rep. So here's the deal. I'll fire you for not being successful, but I will never fire you for being too successful. That is my commitment to you. And they were like, wow, like somebody who actually understands what it's like to be a rep.
Right.
Yep.
Okay. And they would give me disproportionate market share. I was the smallest company on their line card, but I probably got number 3 or number 4 level of attention instead of number 12 because they knew that I would not screw them. And so Synergetic was great fun. I mean, we never had any money, but at least I was not going deeper into debt anymore. and and I was having fun every day. And
Yeah.
yeah, I'm writing these magazine articles and I'm just trying stuff. And I've got this direct marketing education with all these kind of marketing gurus, and I'm taking pieces of what they're teaching me and
Right.
deploying them, and
Yeah.
it was fun.
I love that you indirectly found out the most important piece of any negotiator in the world. And that is, you never want someone to say yes. You never want them to say yes. You want them to say that's right. You want them to understand that you understand them. Because when someone knows that there is this mutual respect that happens,
Yeah,
they're willing to forgive so many mistakes.
yeah,
And guess what? Now it becomes a collaboration for, okay, you get the problem. And
Yeah.
I understand your problem. How can we make this work? And they help you just as much as you try to help them.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. And so, like, I remember one of our reps took us into one of the biggest distributors in Detroit.
Mm-hmm.
And this distributor was courting us. And I remember coming home from that trip and going to my wife's parents' house in Nebraska. And I'm like, I'm 28 years old and the biggest distributor of automation equipment in Detroit is like they're buying me lunches and giving me the dog and pony show and like wanting me to appoint them. And we didn't actually sign them up. We end up doing somebody else.
Yeah.
But wow, that I was so used to pounding the phone, pounding the pavement, being a pest, annoying people, finding any possible way I could. Hey, I'm going to be in the neighborhood and I'm going to drop a brochure by. Could I stop and shake your hand? And like all that nonsense. It was just
Oh, gosh.
awful.
Yeah.
And I lived that for so long. It was just dreadful. So it was so painful. And maybe part of it, John, is I decided, well, my wife's going to be a stay-at-home mom and we're having a family and I'm just going to figure this out.
Right.
And it was kind of a burn the boats kind of a thing.
Yes.
And man, when you better figure it out or else you're going to go home with your tail between your legs. You're going to move back to Nebraska in the farmhouse next to your wife's parents. I remember just before I took the job at Synergetic, it was literally a week before, you guys didn't know that I had gotten fired from that job between the job interview and
Right.
saying yes to the job.
Right.
And I was riding in a pickup truck with Brett, my brother-in-law, and his son had also majored in electrical engineering. He was 7 years younger than me. And he goes, so Perry, it doesn't seem like you guys are really doing all that well. Like, is it going to be there for my son? Because he's getting the same degree you got. And I'm like, well, Brett, I've taken a lot of detours in my career, and I think it's going to be just fine for your son.
Right.
Well, he ended up taking a job in a nuclear power plant. He's doing just fine. He never went into sales. He never got drugged by a car down a highway with his.
Whoa! All right, hold on. Tell me about what?
Well, I'm metaphorically speaking.
Oh, okay.
The sales guy getting drugged
Right.
behind the chain. It's like.
I will say, knowing Mike, if you had told him that you lost your job, his response would have been, "Oh, he can start a week earlier."
Well, Mike was great.
Right.
And that was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I love how so far one of the big things that you seem to keep coming back to that's really interesting to me is this notion internally of I'll figure it out. And I know you said that a part of it is definitely from understanding I don't want to go back. I want to go forward. And I'm wondering, do you feel there's, What do you recall as like one of the first moments where you really felt like, okay, I am going to figure this out? Like, what was that first
Other than the
moment?
conference,
Yeah, other than the conference. Yeah, of course.
which we hadn't done before.
A major figure it out moment was I took an acoustics class in engineering school, and I decided to write a term paper on something called a transmission line speaker enclosure. So when I was 12 or 13, I got ridiculously fascinated with stereo equipment. I wanted to understand all about how it worked. I didn't just want the formula out of the book. I really wanted to understand it,
Yep.
which eventually led me to engineering school. And there was this type of speaker enclosure. It's like a pipe, and you put the speaker on one end, and it's not done very often. And there was no satisfactory formula for how to design one of these things. And I decided to figure it out and derive all the math. And I'm literally starting with Newton's law and working out the wave equations and doing the differential equations. And I really did figure it out. And it was the experience of taking a really simple principle like force equals mass times acceleration, and then rolling it forward to a very complex system, and like working it out. And I would run a simulation on my Hewlett Packard calculator, and it would plot the little points, and it would run my equations, because I didn't have a computer at the time that would do that.
Yep.
And I figured it out, and I had the embodied experience of what today I call touching the bottom of the swamp.
Hmm.
I now know what it feels like to
Mm.
understand something all the way down to the bottom.
Mm.
And then
Hmm.
when I hit future things, I would look for that sensation. So
Hmm.
when I was deprogramming myself from Amway, there was about 6 or 12 months where I really wasn't sure, are the naysayers right and this is really legit, or is this just a scam? Because there were arguments going both ways. And what I did was I put the whole thing on an anvil, and I invited people to speak up, like, come explain this to me. And I'm not going to go into exactly how I did that, but Amway did not stand up.
Yep.
It was a big bag of smoke. There was a whole bunch of stuff they were not telling you. It was not what they told you it was. You did not own a business. You didn't have a title to anything. It,
Mhm.
it, it didn't have a unique selling proposition. Later,
Hmm.
I did the same thing with Christian faith. If I put this on an anvil and I pound on this as hard as I possibly know how, is it going to stand up, or is it going to break? In marketing, it's like, okay, so I just been through this 5 or 6 years of pink Kool-Aid, and I found out that a whole bunch of this was an illusion. Okay, so like, what's the bottom of the swamp with marketing? Well, it was things like having a unique selling proposition, or entering the conversation inside the customer's head, or tracking a conversion. And like, I put this much money in, I got this much money out. In fact, that's how I figured out that Amway didn't really work. Instead of shoe leather, I said, I'm going to make this into envelopes and mail pieces instead. And instead of prospecting people by going to the mall, or talking to waitresses or something, I'm going to send letters. And I found out that the return on investment was like 1 out of 10.
Wow.
Oh, this is impossible. A mail order business is possible. This is impossible. It's disguised by shoe leather, but it's really the most inefficient business I've ever seen. But I didn't know it until I applied a bottom of the swamp principle. I'm like,
Right.
this doesn't work. Okay, I can be done with this. And now I can move on. And I can take the stuff that I've now learned and find stuff that does work. Then I learned a whole encyclopedia of ways to figure out which stuff works, which stuff doesn't, why it works, why it doesn't. And so I just kept doing this and kept doing this and kept doing this. So I get to China and my brother says, I'm not a Christian anymore. I'm not going to be a missionary anymore. I don't believe any of this stuff anymore. And we're both pastors' kids. And we get in an argument about evolution. I go, I'm going to take that bottom of the swamp thing and I'm going to go study evolutionary biology and I'm going to put it on an anvil and I'm going to pound on it and I'm going to see what happens. I have done that a whole bunch of times. And every time you do it, you get faster.
Right.
You get faster and faster and faster. It only took me a week to figure out the usual story in most textbooks about evolution, not true. It took me 2 years to figure out, but evolution's still true. And there's this whole other set of reasons why that the average guy never hears anything about.
I want to come back to that.
Yeah.
Because that's a really interesting story. But I want to talk about how we got there, right? So I'm thinking about communications theory, right? And so for the audience, just so you understand, when a machine talks to another machine to have something work, there's communication going on between those two. And there's some protocols that make this thing operate, right? And so Synergetic was in that space of all of these different protocols that talk between machines, and you became quite fascinated with that. And I'd like you to kind of walk me through why that was interesting to you, because there's an audio component to this.
Yeah.
And that got you eventually to understanding about coding and decoding and to DNA.
Yes.
So kind of walk us through that process, because I think that'll get us to the cancer thing.
So I take the manufacturer's rep job, and now I'm going all over the Chicago area trying to sell connectors and sensors and stuff to people. And one of our manufacturers came in and we did a dog and pony show at the Ford assembly plant in the south side of Chicago. And one of the engineers at our manufacturer had brought a device level network, which meant that the controller that runs a machine is not just straight wires that go into an input, it's talking through a network. And networks were pretty new to most people at this time. And the production manager came walking through and he saw that this network had a feature that if a sensor broke, it would tell you which sensor broke. And you could pinpoint exactly where the problem was and fix it in 5 minutes instead of going through a computer programming and figure out where it stalled out. And he flipped out. He goes, I want that. Well, this was one of the few things on our line card that I could understand. I didn't understand it, but I could. I had the capacity. The other reps at our company didn't really, they weren't geeks. They weren't engineers or anything. And I'm like, okay, I'm taking a cue from that. And so I started learning about these networks. Now, honestly, I probably would not have been interested if I didn't have a wife and a baby at home and like all the economic pressures.
Some motivations.
I had a bunch of motivations. Like, you got to figure out something you can sell. All right, I'm going to sell that. And so I started learning everything I possibly could about these networks. And I started going around and doing more dog and pony shows and doing missionary work. And the problem was we just were not in a position to economically make that work, given the manufacturers I had and all the rest. And so I became a local Chicago expert on this brand new technology that people are just starting to use. I really went to school on it, but it wasn't really possible for me to make a living selling this, which many times in sales, you only find out by trying. No, the market's not really ready for this, or you could make a living selling to the whole country, but you couldn't make a living just selling in Chicago. And so after lots of pain and suffering and soul searching and everything else, I figured I I have to sell something that only an engineer can sell, and it has to be viable. And I understand these networks, and it turns out that this company in Chicago that sold all over North America, they needed somebody, and I was the perfect person. And so I just stepped right into it, and it started working right away. And again, the sense of relief, because we were probably only a few months away from major, like, moving or
Right.
doing something. So I got interested in these networks, and then I came to work at Synergetic, and now I was in a company that would support me, which was really important. They supported what I sold, and so I started. Uh, I'm educating all these engineers. There's 5 or 6 networks you can choose from. Which ones do you choose? How do you make these decisions? And and it got really interesting. It's like, well, I'm a I have a communications background, but it's analog. But now I learned the digital part, so that's interesting. And then the analog part gave me a lived experience, kinesthetic sense of noise and bandwidth and like all the things that anybody dealing with communication does every day. And so I instinctively understood a lot of things. And then I added a lot of education to this. And then I started writing magazine articles about it.
Right.
Then a guy liked my magazine articles and asked me to write an Ethernet book. I didn't know anything about Ethernet, but he goes, well, listen, if you're willing to learn Ethernet, you can write our Ethernet book because I like your writing.
Mm.
And I said,
Wow.
well, okay, so I will go figure out Ethernet. So it's another, I will go figure
I'll
this
figure
out.
it out. Yep.
So I attended a workshop. I bought a bunch of Ethernet books. And I said, well, I'm going to write the Ethernet book I would want to read. I think most of these books are dreadfully boring. They're horrible.
If you don't mind, I'm very curious.
Yeah.
So, because if I don't ask now, I will forget it. What is your actual process, if you've ever thought about what it is, for how you figure something out? I'm always intrigued to hear about it because everyone's process of learning and getting down to that swamp level, what you were talking about, is different. And when you were just talking about Ethernet, I noticed you're like, okay, basically went to like almost like a seminar learning about this. So what tends to be the steps you kind of take?
Mm-hmm.
So my process has 7 steps. And here they are.
Okay.
Dilemma, deconstruction, symbiogenesis, reinvention, depth, canon. So, dilemma. I think
Okay.
everybody can understand what a dilemma is.
Yep.
What we're doing right now does not work. We are going to have to do something else.
Yep.
Okay. Second is deconstruction. Take it apart. Disassemble it into its component parts and figure out how all the parts work and what all the parts are. Get them all out on the table. 3, symbiogenesis. That's a term from biology, it's a merger.
Yep.
So an example of a modern symbiogenesis is taxi plus smartphone app equals Uber.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, you take something and something from somewhere else and you put them together and you get a third thing. Okay.
So it's really breaking it down into what those basic components are.
Yeah. So I take these parts over here and these other parts over here that never were put together, and you stick them together.
Yep.
Okay. Then it's reinvention. So Uber, once they had this, reinvented the industry, and reinvention is not the same thing as symbiogenesis.
Okay.
So, for example, I sold my car 6 or 7 years ago. I take Uber. Now, if I need to drive a long way, I take the kid's car or the wife's car, but I don't own a car. Most places I go in town, I take an Uber.
Right.
You would have never done that with taxis, ever.
Right.
It would make no sense. It makes sense now.
Yep.
So there's a whole economy, there's There's a
Right.
job market and all that.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's 4, reinvention. 5, depth. That's, hey, this is really deep. This isn't just this interesting thing. This has implications that go all over the place. So like 80-20. When I realized that 80-20 was fractal,
Yep.
oh my word.
Yeah, we'll get to
That's
that. Yeah.
this takes us miles in directions that nobody's ever been.
Yep.
Okay. 6, cannon. I shoot it out of a cannon. I evangelize it. Wow, everybody, this is the coolest thing. Okay. Then that's cannon with 2 ends. Step 7 is canon with 1 end,
Yeah.
which is like the body of literature. Make this a part of the knowledge that everybody who's starting from the beginning ought to learn.
Right.
This is my creative process.
Okay. Interesting. That's really cool.
I taught it in the Truth Seminar 6 years ago. That's basically what it is. But those are the 7 steps. It's how I do everything.
Yeah. Wow. So now you were talking about you were just learning Ethernet.
Yeah.
And so what was now looking back then, now that you have this framework looking back, why do you think it was that you chose, okay, I'm learning about this thing, I have to immerse myself in this?
I got a call from a technical publisher and he said, will you write an Ethernet book? And I said, I don't know anything about Ethernet. Can I write a DeviceNet book? And he says, nobody's asking us for a DeviceNet book.
Yeah.
But if you want it, we need an Ethernet book. And if you'll write it, I'll give you the job.
Yep.
And so now I knew what it was. There was an Ethernet cable in every office.
Yep.
And I knew that it was hot. It was growing. It wasn't quite real yet on the factory floor, but it was getting there. And so I referenced all my marketing gurus and I thought, well, if I'm the first guy to write an industrial Ethernet book, that's like first mover position.
Right.
That's a really good idea.
Yep. That's the dilemma.
It means I'll be an authority, which means more opportunities and sales will come my way.
Right.
So if it takes me 6 months to figure out Ethernet and then write a book about it, it's probably worth the trouble. So I said yes. I spent the next 6 months buying Ethernet books and reading through them and figuring out how to write the book that I would want to read that would actually be a little bit interesting.
Right.
You know, a little.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
And that's what I did. And then that book came out. And that was about the time that I left Synergetic. And guess what? Having written that book, there was a couple other companies that were like, he wrote an Ethernet book and he's a marketing consultant. He's going to do our marketing. It was like fall off the log simple for them to hire me. You know, well, no, it didn't make them hire me, but it got me in the door. And then we had a conversation like, yeah, we like you and you're hired. And I probably got $250,000 of business from those clients over a period of, I don't know, 3 or 4 years.
Yeah. Wow.
Not bad.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe that's books sold a grand total of 1,000 copies. I still get a royalty check every 6 months for like $82.
Oh, that's amazing. So we were talking about how do you go from studying communications here, and you're getting some of that journey through Synergetic. And I believe we were talking about like how does that transition all the way over here to basically studying, you know, evolutionary theory, DNA,
right? The coder decoder.
Yeah. So where does, because you mentioned that one of the turning points for when you started to use this figure outedness that you have, and your whole framework for, okay, I know how to figure stuff out, so I'm going to figure this out too. With evolution was when your brother in China was like, hey, no.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, tell me more about like that moment, like, because you had learned, okay, I know how to, beat an anvil on something to find out what happens.
Well, I went to see Brian. I took my daughter with me. She was 8 at the time. And I knew that he had faith questions and existential questions. We'd had emails going back and forth, but I was very unprepared for him saying, "So, Perry, I don't believe this anymore. I'm done. I'm going to move home in a couple months. I'm quitting my missionary job, and I've pretty much already made up my mind." This totally blindsided me. And I found this very upsetting. Also, we had already been having a conversation about this for a year or two. So I already knew what his questions are, and you have not had that conversation until you've had it with a guy with a master's degree in theology, and he knows Greek and Hebrew, and you've grown up together, and he's very, very, very good at getting to the bottom of the swamp and asking tough questions.
Yeah.
And he's like, "No, man, like, I'm done with this." So I had serious questions about maybe my whole belief system is wrong. Maybe Brian is right. I don't know. And I reverted to engineering. Instinctively, I go, "Brian, look at the hand at the end of your arm." And then we get in this argument about evolution, which I don't know anything about. I just have my engineering instincts like, well, I'm pretty sure there's a lot of engineering going on here. I'm pretty sure this isn't random accidents. But wait a minute, I know a bunch of biologists think it is random accidents. So since he's already pushed me to the edge,
Yep.
I'm going to go home and I'm going to let science figure this out for me, because I know all about theology. My dad was a pastor.
Yep.
The truth about theologians is they can do shell games
Yeah.
forever.
Yeah.
You can't do shell games with Ohm's law. You can't do shell games with F equals MA. And I thought, you know what? I don't care what anybody told me growing up. Theology is squishy and engineering is not. So I'm going to let engineering make this decision for me. And if this turns me an atheist, okay, so be it. Now that's terrifying. Like, I could be arguing with my wife about taking the kids to Sunday school and what we're going to read at bedtime and whether dad's going to go to church and Thanksgiving dinner and all the rest. Well, here we go. Now, I'm going to figure this out.
Did she know you were doing this?
Yes, she knew that. And she, yes.
Yeah,
and she
that's
knew
what makes
that
her special.
there
Wow.
wasn't a damn thing she could do about it.
Wow.
And she's just like, well, okay, here we go. And
He's
so
gonna figure it out. So
That's
I'm-
right. Because I know that's the thing.
so I start buying books. Well, it didn't take long. I had a massive epiphany. Before I get there, biology is about 100,000 times more complicated than electrical engineering. And I am not kidding. I think the most sophisticated thing that is going on right now at ChatGPT or OpenAI or Google or you name it, Tesla, nothing compared to one cell. Nothing. I don't even think we know 5% of how biology works. I think we're barely at the foothills. But man, this stuff was complicated and it wasn't linear. So I was lost for a while. But I was trying to understand DNA, and one day, bam, I've seen this before. I have absolutely seen this. This is digital communication. This is just like Ethernet. A DNA strand gets turned into RNA, which turns into amino acids, encoding, decoding. DNA is copied from one cell to another. That's just like sending an email.
Right.
It's the same thing. The math is the same, and I'm already at the bottom of the swamp.
and
And
what,
this-
when was this? Because you figured this out long before this became common knowledge for a lot of
It
people.
took 2 weeks. It took me 2 weeks to figure out DNA is code, and it works by all the rules of everything I did at Synergetic and wrote in that Ethernet book.
Right.
And it was, when you have an epiphany like that, it is intensely pleasurable. It's like all these circuits in your brain suddenly connect. Oh, well, doesn't make me a cell biologist, but I now have a place to start. I can start with this. I have touched the bottom of the swamp. Everything anybody tells me has to fit this because this is a fundamental principle of the world. And it is. You go to Claude Shannon and all those guys, they figured out all the math of communication, and it's correct. And so now all of a sudden, now I have some confidence. I can start chiseling away, and figuring it out.
So you started to figure all this out. So DNA is a code,
Yep.
right? So at this point, you are, I mean, at this point right now, are you doing a lot of your, digital marketing stuff still, or like what?
Yeah, so this is 2004. What
Okay.
that means is I've been teaching Google Ads for a year.
Okay.
I've been deeply immersed in marketing now for about 5 or 6 years. I have a reputation as a marketing expert with Google Ads that is really starting to take off.
Right.
And all the internet marketing people like me. And
now you're hit with this epiphany. You're like, I need to do something with this.
yeah, well, this really was a burning existential question. I really wanted to know, is the hand at the end of my arm really a purposeful thing, or is that just an illusion? This is an extremely important question. And so I'm trying to figure all this out. And so I decided to put my science beliefs and my religious beliefs on a public anvil, a little like what I'd done a couple, 3 years before that with Amway. Amway had caved in. This is not real. Okay, how about my science ideas? How about my faith ideas? So I put together a couple of websites. The first one was called Coffee House Theology, and I had this email series called 7 Great Lies of Organized Religion. And then once I had this code stuff figured out, I had this other website called Cosmic Fingerprints, which is now turned into Evolution 2.0. And I had this email series, Where Did the Universe Come From? And it started with the Big Bang, and it went through the fine-tuning of the universe, and it ended up with DNA as code. All of the other codes are designed. So this sure looks like DNA is designed. Can anybody poke a hole in this? And because I was a Google advertising expert, because I was now making good money, I made this my tax write-off.
Yep.
And for about 5 years, I spent $2,000 to $3,000 a month buying clicks for 1 to 10 cents a click.
Yep.
Driving people to these websites, and I would answer every reasonable question that anybody asked me. I would do this late at night.
Yep.
All right, it's like 10 o'clock, the kids are in bed. I'm doing this until midnight.
Yep.
And I would sit there and I would answer questions. And I was like, is anybody going to poke a hole in the basic Christian story? Is anybody going to poke a hole in my DNA as a code? All the other codes are designed, therefore we have an inference to design. Can anybody poke a hole in this stuff? I answered probably 20,000 emails. I am not kidding. And I talked to every kind of person you could possibly imagine, from, Jehovah's Witnesses and Jews and Mormons and Muslims and Hare Krishnas and Buddhists and like everything you can imagine. And I had conversations with all these people. And so on the faith side, what it did, it kind of 80-20'd my theology. It was like, 1% of this belief system is 50% of what you need to know.
Right.
And that's the stuff that matters. And then on the evolution stuff, it was not only a search for scientific facts, but it was also a question of how do you explain this to people, given
Yep.
how complicated biology is?
Yep.
How to reduce this to something that people can comprehend. And that's especially tricky if you're arguing about a complex topic. It'll just go round and round and
Yep.
round in circles.
Right.
So I had to figure out how to simplify it. This
Yep.
is basically why I ended up with a $10 million prize.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you could get people to agree that the prize had been correctly defined,
Yep.
then it only comes down to, did anybody win the money or not?
Yep.
And that makes one of the most profound questions in the history of science reducible to a Homer Simpson. Did they get the money or did they not get the money? Did they solve this? Did they not solve this?
Yeah. And just for clarification out there, so what you ended up doing was, just to put this story in a tighter frame right now, right? Your brother's like, hey, evolution's real, creationism is not real. You're like, okay, I believe that engineering and science is in the scientific method, which you're basically following. You're like, I have a theory. I'm going to let other people disprove my theory. And if it stands for long enough, then it becomes almost a law, right? And, it goes through that process. And so you had an epiphany because you went down to the bottom of the swamp, which was DNA. And you're like, okay, this looks like that.
Yeah.
And you're like, this is a code. And so a code needs a decoder and an encoder. You can't have one without the other.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing a lot of decoding, which means there must have been something before that made the code. And
That's right.
so you made a book, you made a whole contest in answering people. And to this day, you haven't had anyone be able to poke a hole to the point where that $10 million prize pool has actually been given to someone.
Right.
Yeah.
What is it they have to prove or disprove in order to win?
They have to pour chemicals in a bathtub and getting an encoder to send messages to the decoder. And they have to show that it encoded and decoded something properly. And if they can get that to work with 5 bits of information, then they win the prize. So they just need to get communication from point A to point B to happen without anybody cheating. It's not really that complicated, but nobody's even come close to solving it. And I found out pretty quick, nobody has any idea where the genetic code came from. Now, you'll find lots of hand-waving explanations. And this was the thing, this really, really pissed me off. It really pissed me off that you could spend $100,000 or $200,000, send your kid to university, and that school will give them a paper mache answer to some of the most important questions, and not even tell them that they're giving them a paper mache answer.
Yeah.
Because when I really got inside the field and saw what was going on, I was appalled. I can't believe the intellectual slop that passes for science in evolutionary biology. Now, I'm not saying evolution is a fraud. I mean, this is the twist in the story that's really interesting.
Yeah.
I came to the conclusion, yes, things really evolve, things do evolve, you can prove it, it happens in the lab all the time, but it happens through a system of mechanisms that is so astonishingly sophisticated. It's beyond anything. Like a teaspoon of bacteria is more sophisticated than a building full of Google engineers.
Yep.
And like, nobody is properly explaining this. Like, what is going on here?
Mm-hmm.
So I just got more and more intrigued.
So you're back at Amway.
Yeah. Well, why don't you elaborate on that?
Well, you talked about Amway being something that when you broke it down, it wasn't truthful, right? It didn't stand the test, right?
Yeah.
And so now you're right back where you were before.
Yeah.
See, in all of our interviews, we find this to be true, that there are things that start off almost in someone's childhood. and it gets repeated throughout
Yes.
their life.
Yes.
So this
Yeah.
is, you were talking about pattern recognition earlier, or at least we were alluding to that. And this is a pattern in your life that's occurred over and over again. So this is just another like, oh, it's another Perry thing.
Yes. And in fact, Megan Macedo, who helped me figure out those 7 things that I told you about, one time we were at a bar in London and she goes, "So Perry, you know that story about your mom and your dad and the psychiatrist in the church demoting your dad?" I go, "Yeah." She goes, "You realize that's a war between science and religion story, don't you?"
Mm,
And I go, "No, not till you just said it now. Now it's bloody obvious."
right.
And so, yes, I've been recapitulating the church story, but now I'm doing it in science.
Right.
Because here's what's going on in science. So back to where I grew up. I had a charismatic lead pastor. He's got 3,000 people, which is a lot of people in Lincoln, Nebraska, and they're all yes sir, no sir, following the yellow brick road. And there's a little man behind the curtain stuff going on. And dad gets demoted and he stands up to the guy and kind of does the man behind the curtain thing.
Right.
And straightens him out. I get into science and I find out scientists in science are just as religious, they're just as metaphysical as the Catholic Church or a Hindu or a Muslim or anybody. They have a sacred set of beliefs, and you start poking at those, and
Right.
people get defensive.
Yep.
People start calling you names. People start yanking your funding. They start threatening you. And you find out there's not nearly as much freedom of speech as you really thought there was. There's a whole bunch of people quietly laboring in a huge levels of frustration. And they're not doing the real work. They're pretending to do the work
Mm-hmm.
all over again.
Yep.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, I know. I was sitting maybe 9 months ago. I was in Boston. I was at a cancer conference in a big hotel ballroom. And I had this thought that just hit me. Why does this remind me of church? Like church growing up.
Yep.
I'm in a large auditorium with a bunch of obedient people. There's somebody in the front giving a presentation in a language that you have to have been here to understand, because I was in a very theological church with Greek words and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
There's an elephant in the room. Nobody's saying what it is. And if you say certain things on that stage, a little hook will come and pull you off. Oh, I am perfectly prepared to be here.
So I want to bottle that up a little bit. I want to put it in like a Ziploc container, let it marinate a little bit, because that's, there's even more of that story to come, right? So you should keep listening, right?
Right.
But there's another part of your life that I find very interesting, and I personally have never been able to ask you about. And I want to go all the way back to the day where you made the decision that you want to adopt a child from China. And tell me about what happened.
Well, when we were married, maybe a year or two, I remember it was a cold winter morning and we were riding in the car, and we're in college and we're in our 20s, and they were talking about foster care on the radio. And my wife goes, "I want to do that." I'm like, "You want to do what?" Like foster's the worst of all. Like the kid's with you and then they leave and then there's another kid. Oh, that's horrible.
Yep.
Well, her dad was adopted and she kind of wore me down over the next, 15 years.
This was her version of the I am getting to the bottom of evolution creationism. There's nothing you can do about it. So hers was like, we are doing this and there's nothing you're doing about it.
And we had some neighbors who
Hmm.
fostered 3 kids, and we got to know them, and we had conversations about that. And at one point, we finally, this is when I worked at Synergetic, we agreed to take a temporary infant foster child, and we had her for 2.5 months. And so it was about 6 months before Kyler was born. Laura was pregnant with Kyler, our second, and we got a call. We've got a week-old drug-exposed baby from the west side of Chicago. You want to take her? And Laura calls me at work. I go, okay, here we go. And so now we're taking care of this little black girl named Drea. And so we took care of her. And then a few months later, the social worker calls. She goes, her paternal grandmother wants to take her. Thank you very much. And we hand her off. And I thought that was the end. Then 2 weeks later, we get another phone call from the same social worker. And she says, the grandmother would like you to be her godparents. Would you be interested in that? So we trucked over to the old Ship of Zion Church of God in Christ on the west side of Chicago, where we were the only white people. And they had this christening in the storefront of this church on Chicago Avenue in the Austin neighborhood. And we became her godparents, which kind of, and then she had 3 older brothers that were from the same biological parents who lived with their grandma also. We went over to their house and we basically became their cousins from the suburbs.
Wow.
And I took those kids to church for 10 years.
Wow.
And we still know them. I picked up one of them when he got out of prison about 10 years ago. And so we have this whole relationship with this family. So we did that for 2.5 months. And then we had our kids. And when we were done having 4 kids, we decided we're going to adopt a child from China.
Yep.
And 4.5.
Because that's the logical conclusion that you come to after 4 children.
Well,
yeah, good point. Like what?
Laura always intended that if she had the bandwidth, that she would take in a child that otherwise would not get a home. And so we adopted Zaylin in 2011. She was 19 months old. She had a problem with one leg where she had a deformed foot and a missing fibula. When we got her, she didn't walk, she didn't crawl, she didn't sit up or feed herself. And within a few weeks, she was doing all of the above. Wow. With brothers and sisters. And
wow.
And she's done great. And then
she's an athlete now.
Yes, she's in wheelchair basketball.
She's really good.
Right now, as we're filming this, the Paralympics are going on in Paris, and she knows some of the Paralympians that are in Paris right now. And so she knows all these people. She's 14. And then we have ZJ, and he's 19, and we adopted him when he was 9.5, which was 3 years after we adopted Zaylin. So we have 4 standard issue, 2 adopted.
Standard issue, yeah. I'm just thinking of the standard issue ones because come with like a stamp, like
right.
Yeah,
exactly right. Out of the production mission.
Yeah, exactly.
So Mama Laura gets most of the credit, has done most of the work. She's incredible.
Yeah, that's awesome.
What was that process like? Because I have some friends who have adopted from some people in like the Dominican Republic or places like Peru and etc. And it can be really tough. Like, it's a huge process a
It's
lot of times.
extremely bureaucratic.
Yeah, like, everyone wants their own money, and sometimes
Yeah.
it doesn't even go
Oh,
through.
yeah. Yeah, we had to take both adoptions. We had to take, I forget the amount. I It was thousands of dollars of cash at the adoption, in
Yeah,
addition to all of the other, like it has to be in Chinese renminbi notes, and they do with it whatever it is they do with it.
yep,
But on top of all the other fees and the plane tickets and everything, yes.
yeah. So what
It took 4.5 years to do the first adoption and a year and a half to do the second adoption.
So I have to ask from a man whose life motto at this point, I'm just going to say and mail you at Christmas, like some kind of stamp that says, I'll figure this out. What was it like figuring out being a parent to two children that aren't literally, your own flesh and blood?
Well, um, there's a phrase or an acronym in the adoption community. It's called RH. It stands for reluctant husband.
Okay, okay.
This kind of scared me to death, for all kinds of reasons. I was afraid my wife might emotionally disappear for who knows how long. I was afraid that, I mean, anybody doing an adoption ought to know that sometimes it can be very rough. It's not little orphan Annie where they are, oh, thank you, Daddy Warbucks, you're so amazing. There can often be in adoptions kind of a no good deed will go unpunished kind of
Wow.
Yeah.
way that kids treat the parents, because adopted kids, they have an embodied experience of, I apparently was not good enough and I got rejected, and they have that in their memory no matter how early that happened.
Mm.
Sure.
And and that is a belief, and their system is wired to reinforce that belief. So they will push you away. You can expect that. And there's a whole function of the adoption community is help parents deal with kids who they respond to stimuli completely different than the biological kids do. You have to handle discipline differently. You have to handle everything differently. It's a whole different
Wow.
universe. And so, to be honest, it scared me to death.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a moment, this would be maybe a year or two before we actually got Zaylin. I had what I call a Holy Spirit highlighter moment.
A Holy Spirit highlighter.
Yeah, it's when a scripture jumps out of the page and attacks you on the face. So I was reading in Isaiah, and it says, they ask me for just decrees. They want to be near God. They lament. Why don't you notice when we fast? Why don't you pay attention when we humble ourselves? Look, at the same time you fast, you satisfy your selfish desires, you oppress your workers. Your fasting is accompanied by arguments, brawls, and fistfights. Do not fast as you do today, trying to make your voice heard in heaven. Is this really the kind of fasting I want? Do I want a day when people merely humble themselves, bowing their heads like a reed and stretching out on sackcloth and ashes? Is this really what you call a fast? No, this is the kind of fast I want. I want you to remove the sinful chains, tear away the ropes of the burdensome yoke,
Mm.
set free the oppressed, break every burdensome yoke. I want you to share your food with the hungry and provide shelter for homeless, oppressed people. When you see somebody naked, clothe them. Don't turn your back on your own flesh and blood. Then your light will shine like the sunrise. Your restoration will quickly arrive. Your godly behavior will go before you, and the Lord's splendor will be your rear guard. Then you will call out, and the Lord will respond. You will cry out, he will reply, here I am.
Thank you. That makes it real.
And I read that, and what I was thinking was, how on earth are we going to keep this careening jalopy of our life on a road if we add an adoption to all of this other stuff?
Right.
And the message was like, you take care of the poorest of the poor, and I take care of you.
Hmm.
Okay, I guess that's what we're doing.
Yep.
So, like, I think anybody who didn't tell you that this is terrifying is not being honest. It's very, very tricky. I think we've been very fortunate. Um, our our adopted kids have turned out well. It has not been without drama. There's counselors and one counselor. We have a counselor named Margaret who's 88 years old. I have my list of favorite octogenarians, and she's one of them. And we hit a really tough spot, and our social worker said, you need to meet Margaret. Margaret had run an adoption agency, and in her life, she had fostered or adopted 13 kids. And she, in her 80s, had 2 teenagers living in her house that she had adopted, which are still in her house now. And she became the family counselor. And she would come over. So she's met with every single one of us, some of us many, many times. And one of the first meetings we had with her, she came over and she did a family meeting, and she got everybody in the living room, and we got these issues, and she walked us through how to all get on the same page. So we've had a lot of help.
Wow. Yeah. I think I've never thought about the point of you have to learn how to give love so unconditionally to someone who's, what you said, almost programmed to want to reject it because they've known at some point they've been rejected.
Well, this is why Christianity is an adoption story. I mean, humanity mostly pushes God away.
Right.
I think it's a very apt analogy for the way things really are. So I think the way things really are is God is more loving and less judgmental than you know. And I think the fire and brimstone crowd has really jacked this one up. And most people are like an adopted kid. So my wife is in different adoption groups, and one time she showed me this picture that was taken in one of her groups, and a woman had gone, I think it was Bulgaria. It was one of these really poor Eastern European countries.
Yep.
With terrible orphanages. She adopted a 9-year-old girl who literally looked like she was a year and a half. And there was a photograph of, it was one of the first times the adoptive mom had picked up the girl. The girl was pushing her away as hard as she knew how.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, if you can snapshot that and you can say in your adult mind, and okay, so they flew all the way to Bulgaria and they went to an orphanage and they did all the paperwork and they've got this little girl. If you can fix in your mind the perspective that this girl obviously has from all this neglect and contrast it with what you know is the truth, that is the truth about the relationship between God and man.
Right.
It's man pushing away.
Mm-hmm.
Because we know better.
And God welcoming us.
Mm-hmm.
That no matter how many times you keep pushing.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that is our model in our everyday life as believers, to live that kind of love for other people. That's really tough when they push you away over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And you can't make them accept it.
Right.
And one of the things you learn as an adoptive parent is there's an appropriate amount of, making the offer
Right.
and respecting the agency of the other person,
Mhm.
letting them work things out. I feel like I grew up in a Christian environment that just by default implicitly assumed that it's our job to control everybody's behavior. No, that is not your job. God doesn't control everybody's behavior. Like, the Ten Commandments is a list of things on a piece of paper. It's not a hot poker stick. You don't want to do that? It's up to you. And so, there's a lot to learn and discover in parenting. Of course, when I had my bio kids, you don't know until you become a parent how crazy you are about that baby.
Right. So true.
You can't explain that.
Yeah. You'll do anything for them. Right.
Yeah.
So I have to take a little bit of a hard cut here.
Sure. Wherever you
Because
want to go. You guys are doing great, by the way.
I want to come back and end our time talking about the cancer research.
Hmm.
And I want to take that last tangent there because I think all the things that you've done in your life and the experiences you've had and the things you've had to deal with and learn really give a lot of that background story necessary for understanding a lot of like the wisdom and learnings you've learned now way over here.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so I have to ask you, we had spent a lot of time talking about, encoder, decoder,
Yeah.
how there's almost this joint relationship to you between, creationism and evolution.
Yeah.
Just evolution in a
Yeah.
very different sense than most people are taught.
Mm-hmm.
That's a whole different can of worms that would be fun to do a whole episode about sometime. But how do you get from there? Because at this point, you've published an entire book on this, Evolution 2.0.
Yep.
And you have your whole competition out there. No one's come to it, even yet to this day, 2024.
Right.
And how do you get from there to now all of a sudden you're on the bleeding edge? You are working with people, literally finding potential cures for cancer and extremely early detection
Yes.
that no one watching this has probably ever heard of.
Right.
We have this question of, where did the code come from? And Well, I think all of my research shows that consciousness comes before code, not after. And that is a reversal of the normal academic cause and effect story. I think consciousness is something fundamental in the universe and not just something that shows up eventually at some point in time. Well, consciousness is also a central question in evolution, because if you understand real evolutionary experiments that happen in real time, your next question is, how did those cells know how to do that? So I'll just give you one little example. Michael Levin did an experiment where he took tadpoles and he put barium in the water, and barium causes their heads to explode because of the way that affects the ion channels of the cells that the cells use to communicate. But then the heads grow back and they're barium resistant immediately.
Whoa.
Nobody has any reason to believe that there's ever been a barium evolution history of tadpoles, a billion years ago. As far as anybody can tell, this is a completely new situation that's never happened in history. And it fails the first time, and then it engineers a solution immediately afterwards. This is how intelligent cells are. And this question has been reverberating in my mind now for probably about 18 years, because when I figured out, oh, cells are smart, and there's a whole vein of literature about this, I thought, this is way more interesting than the creation evolution people or any of the stuff these people are arguing about. This is way deeper
Or
and
your
way more
Ethernet book.
or Ethernet book. Oh yeah, This is light years beyond Ethernet. And so I started becoming friends with scientists, and some of them mentoring relationships. James Shapiro has been the leading person for me. He's a wonderful guy at the University of Chicago. I think he's the best evolution guy alive. And it just became inevitable as I got so incredibly interested in these things that I would start having conversations with the people that are on the leading edge of these questions, because frankly, there's not that many of them. There's not that many people asking these questions. And so I started becoming friends with people, and I got judges for my prize. I got invited to the Royal Society. That kind of was like my equivalent to a PhD, I would say. It started opening doors. Well, then James Shapiro emailed me almost 5 years ago, and he says, hey, I've got these two other guys. We want to do a cancer and evolution symposium. Will you help us organize it? Because you're a marketing guy too. And I said, absolutely, I'm in. And so we started organizing this thing, and it probably would have been at Harvard, but because one of the guys is very tied in with people there, but the pandemic pushed it to Zoom.
Yep.
Probably ended up being an advantage. We got all the speakers we wanted except for one, and we had about 300 participants. And after the conference, I got a phone call from a guy that I had met at a conference who attended our Cancer and Evolution conference. And he said, I've been in the pharmaceutical industry for 30 years, and this is the best conference I've ever attended in my entire science career. And I said, why is that? And he said, I'll tell you why. He said, it's because there's two kinds of people in science. There's splitters and clumpers.
Splitters and clumpers?
Okay. What's a splitter and what's a clumper? And he says, a splitter is a person who subdivides and subdivides and subdivides, and they just go deeper, 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 deeper. And by the time they're 60 years old, they only know about one thing, and they know like everything there is to know about the folding of some protein, and they frankly don't know anything else. And that's a splitter. And most scientists are splitters. He said, now here's a clumper is a person who they're interested in lots of different things. And at some point they stand up in the middle of the vast cubicle farm and they look around and they go, so does anybody know how this works? And somebody goes, yeah, I think the guy in department F14 does. And then they go to that guy and he goes, well, I think the guy in E12 knows. And then, well, I think the guy in K7 knows. And they find out nobody knows.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody just assumes somebody else knows. And he goes, almost every speaker at your conference was a clumper, because they go around and they figure out what does everybody actually know, what does everybody not know, and they ask questions that everybody else is afraid to ask.
Yep. This reminds me so much of the very first thing in my speech class in high school taught. And everyone in the class of 20 high school kids were given a piece of paper with a different piece of information on it. And it was for a mystery. And the class inward teacher said, go figure out the mystery. And everyone's talking to everyone else. And I'm like, this is BS. This is stupid. And so I basically went to the front of the classroom with my buddies and said, you are going to walk up and you're going to give me your piece of paper and I'm going to write out what it says on the chalkboard. And then everyone came up and within about 5 minutes, we figured everything out. And he said, you are the fastest person who have ever figured out that the reason for the study is how fast you actually come together, clump,
Yes.
basically in a group and put everything on a whiteboard.
Yes. And I was the chair of the third day of that conference, and I gave a presentation at that conference. And when we were in the wrap-up session, we're in the home stretch, and all the speakers came on for Q&A. And I said, hey, I want to ask everybody a question. So just some setup here. We had chemists, physicists, astrophysicists, oncologists, biologists, embryonic development people. We had immunologists. Like, we had every kind of scientist in our faculty. There's like 30 people. You can go to cancerevolution.org and you can see the whole thing. I said, how many of you, raise your hand, are reluctant to admit you really only understood about a third of what everybody else was talking about for the last 3 days? And all these hands go up. And I said, that is entirely okay, because that is the only way we can have an interdisciplinary conversation. And it has to be in plain English. And a chemist and a oncologist have to be able to talk to each other in plain English. And if you can't do that, then it might mean that nobody understands even what they're doing.
Right.
And a couple of the other speakers were like, yes. In fact, one of them said, you know, Perry, you're right. And we bring students into universities and they're full of curiosity and we turn them into bureaucrats. We say, no, like, stay in your lane and just study this one thing. And they lose all their curiosity and they become just like us. And she goes, this was great. And I just felt wonderful about it. And so this started something, and we started having monthly Zoom meetings, and we'd have 100 scientists showing up, and it was really enthusiastic. And it did not take me very long at all to find people who, A, were doing absolutely extraordinary work, like flippin' unbelievable stuff, and they were seething with frustration. Like, one guy told me, he said, I hate applying for government grants, and I tell my grad students, do not let on that we're doing anything revolutionary or we'll never get a dime. Just give Homer Simpson the donuts and we'll figure out how to do the
happen,
innovation stuff in the background.
Yeah, yeah.
Because government peer review and grant committees are so risk averse that everybody's afraid of funding something that ended up going nowhere. And so they only incremental stuff, which means you're just splitting and splitting and splitting and splitting infinitely.
Yep.
There must be, I don't know how many, I bet there's 10 million scientific papers on the internet,
Mm-hmm.
at least. and 80 or 90% of them is just splitting, 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 splitting. And then in fields that I understand well, especially biology. This is not as true in physics or chemistry, but especially in biology, a whole bunch of them aren't even close to the bottom of the swamp. They're just somewhere in the middle.
Yep.
And so I said, well, we have to find a way to fund some of this research. And so I started a 501c3, which is a whole nother, oh my goodness, I had no idea what I was getting myself into.
But you're just going to figure it out.
Yeah.
But we're going to figure it out.
Yeah.
And so we're figuring it out right now.
Yep. So you made the leap. You're like, okay, I mean, really, truly, because of I'll figure it out. And I really liked about almost something you alluded to back when you were talking about, hey, these MacBooks, we're going to just give out tons of them. It's almost just like this little bit of you that's like, sometimes you have to challenge the authority on something,
Yeah. Well, after a while, you just figure out the pattern. Like, I think, speaking as a consultant who's worked in 300 industries, almost all industries are 50 years behind state of the art.
Mm-hmm.
Almost all. Okay, maybe the computer people are only 12 years behind state of the art, but like cancer treatment is 50 years behind state of the art. Changing standard of care is like wearing away rock.
Tell me why you think that is. Is it because of the unwillingness for a lot of people to have that sometimes challenge authority feeling, or?
Well, I call it the science publishing circle jerk.
Okay.
So scientists publish things and they need citations. Before it gets published, it has to get peer reviewed, which is sort of like citations. So you're starting with anything you publish has to get through a committee first. So you write a scientific paper, it has to get through a committee, then it gets published, then you're hoping that it gets citations from other papers, which means they have to agree with it. And then you can only get funding for more scientific research as if all the previous people agreed with what you were doing. And then that gets turned into textbooks, which is far out of date of what is really going on. And then the textbooks are adopted by the universities who train the scientists who have to start at step one and go back. And so what happens is there's like 100,000 tiny little steps in that whole entire journey. And like 10 people are in charge of each step, which means there's like 10,000 people.
Yep.
And if anybody does not do their step as efficiently as possible, the chain breaks and the people upstream or downstream get out a whip and they hit them. And so the thing has to go around in a very prescribed manner. And government funding and we've got to get the politicians to agree to all this. And so it's an extremely bureaucratic process that punishes innovators. So
because innovation inherently goes against the grain.
Yes.
It has to.
Yes, and people build entire careers on theories that get cited, and the number of citations are how good of a scientist they are. And so to admit that your theory is wrong and that we need to back up and start over, most people will not do it.
Right. Right. It's proven science.
Yeah. It's
Right.
proven science.
Yep.
Right.
And so I found that the problem in evolutionary biology was really a cultural problem
Yep.
more than it was a science problem. But I found that, so here's what's always true. No matter how bureaucratic it is, no matter how jacked up it is, no matter how messed up it is, there are people doing good work anyway. And there are people who are truth tellers anyway.
Yep.
And they won't cave in. And it might only be 5% of them, or it might only be 1% of them. But they are determined to do good science.
They're the biblical remnant.
They are the remnant. And their papers, you know, maybe 2/3 of the papers are BS, but 5% of them aren't. I promise you.
Yep.
And that literature is in there. Once I knew where to start looking, once I found Barbara McClintock and James Shapiro, I was like, oh, who do they cite? And what experiments are they talking about? And
Yeah.
you find there's this whole other world.
Right.
Yep.
And it's been there all along.
Yeah.
And so you could go, well, that's terrible. You know, look, this is how the whole world is.
Right.
This is the way it is. Hello, people, like take the red pill. Most of what you read in the news isn't what happened. Most of what politicians say isn't what they're going to do or isn't what they did. A whole lot of the stuff you study in school is BS, especially if it's not an exact science. Now, electrical engineering was not mostly BS. In fact, I would say 98% of what I got in my electrical engineering degree was good.
I mean,
And that's true in exact sciences.
exactly.
Right.
You can't
Within
hide
a
it.
certain purview.
Sure. Especially digital,
Right.
because it's a special case of analog.
But even that, it gave me, so I get educated in theology first, which is squishy. They told me it was exact. And this was actually why Brian broke away. Brian was in China. He'd lived there for 4 years. Nobody could breathe down his neck. Nobody could control what he read or what website he visited. And he started figuring out that the Excel spreadsheet of exact systematic theology answers that he had been handed on a silver platter is, if he changes this cell number C17, it changes B14, which is, you know, and pretty soon the whole thing's unraveled. And he figured this out. Like, well, they told me they had it all figured out. They don't have it all figured out. So theology is squishy. Electrical engineering is not squishy. I'm going to start with electrical engineering, and I'm going to eventually end up in biology, which is squishy, but I'm going to use as much not squishy stuff as I possibly can to figure out the squishy world. Now, here's the thing. The squishy stuff is where all the maturity is required. You don't need a lot of emotional maturity to do electrical engineering because it's an exact science. But the reason biology is not a hard science is because it's too sophisticated for that. The reason is, I think every cell on Earth has some itty bitty bit of consciousness, which means that it has volition, which means it has something like free will, which means you can never, ever, ever reduce biology or anything that runs on biology to exact equations.
Yeah, there'll forever be a lambda in
So
everything.
Anthropology, sociology, economics, marketing, business, biology are all soft sciences. So let me tell you a story that I think ties some of this together. My favorite professor was a guy named Robert Knoll, and he was 67 when I was a sophomore in college. And he was like the best professor at the University of Nebraska. Everybody knew he was amazing. and his classes were hard to get into, and I got into one of his classes. And our first paper was on Beowulf. And instead of writing an analysis of the Beowulf story, I decided to take a chance. And I wrote a story of myself, basically, but I said, I am Beomath. And I am going to engineer this trebuchet that's going to heave the stone, and it's going to kill the monster. And I wrote it in Middle English, sort of. And like at the end, I kill the monster. And I turn in this kind of creative essay. I'm like, well, I hope he likes it. I hope I don't get an F. He liked it. Well, I was walking out the door at the end of class. He goes, I would like to talk to you. Am I in trouble? No, you're not in trouble. I would like to come to my office sometime. I think I've read your papers. Come to my office sometime. So I go to his office. And he goes, what are you majoring in? I go, electrical engineering. And he goes, well, I am trying to figure out why you think that's interesting. Now, I thought he was insulting me, or we are having some rivalry between the English department and the engineering department.
Yeah.
No. He goes, you understand people. Because I've been reading your papers. And I don't understand why a person who understands people is over in the engineering department studying things, because things are not as interesting as people. It's like, what's up with that?
Yeah.
So I tell him about my speaker projects and my audio. It's like, I really got to know this. And he goes, speakers. So I'm guessing like you like showing them off to people. Is that right? Yeah. You like their reactions, right? Yeah. He goes, okay, I get it. He goes, all right, so you understand things and you understand people. Most people are one or the other. Most people are not both.
Yep.
He goes, that's a gift. And nobody's ever had this conversation with me before. This is completely new. He goes, you would be very good at technical sales. I'd never heard of technical sales. He goes, as a matter of fact, I think you'll be the president of the company. Because you need to explain things to people and people to things, processes. I was 20 years old. This was absolutely new. And that was one of the best conversations I ever had.
That was your anointing.
It was.
Yeah. Right. Hey, you're back to being a man who understands people, studying people.
Yeah. And very complicated things like cancer.
Yeah.
But see, cancer cells are like people. Every time I explain cancer, I anthropomorphize it. Normally in biology, you're not supposed to do that. Oh, we don't like anthropomorphizing things.
Yeah. So because we only got a little bit of time left here.
Yeah.
I want to give a little bit at the end for us to do our classic thing where we let you, give advice or anything you want to all the cameras over here, right? As your reward for making it through this, right? So I'd love if you could give everyone listening in the biggest challenge you probably ever had to do. The people who were pitching DNA, they said, I could explain DNA to you in 1 minute. So I'm going to give you 10 minutes to explain, okay, what really is cancer? And what are some of the things that you're seeing right now with your team, super far, like 50 years ahead of where a lot of other people are, that someone listening would be like, okay, this is really exciting and interesting where things could potentially go. And that's a tall order because that's 10 minutes. And when we've talked about this, it was 3 hours before.
So every cell on Earth almost has the ability to re-engineer itself, cut, splice, rearrange its DNA, change its own heredity, change its own genetics, sense whatever's going on in the environment, adapt to it at high speed. And this is what makes evolution possible. And Cancer is when the cells of your own body go rogue and start evolving out of control. So let's say it's your kidneys. Used to be a great place to work, used to have good morale, used to have long breaks, used to have a nice boss. Well, now it's stinky in here and the work hours are too long and the breaks are too short and the food is bad. Get me out of here. And those kidney cells literally want to leave and they are stressed out. They feel threatened. Maybe they're not getting enough oxygen. Maybe they're not getting enough nutrients. They start switching on evolutionary mechanisms to defend themselves.
Because they want to get out.
Well, they start changing just to survive. And then a white blood cell goes swimming by. Hey, if you give me a ride out of here, I'll give you immortality. Let's do a merger acquisition. And the white blood cell goes, immortality sounds good. I like that idea. And they merge together and they go floating off into the bloodstream. And that is what we call a polyploid giant cancer cell. And that is the mother of many cancers. It's not cancer yet, but at some point it will start spilling out baby cancer cells, which will metastasize. And those cells, those baby cells, they do not consider themselves a part of you. They consider themselves to be independent renegades, as though they were just floating around in the ocean hunting for food. And so they recruit arteries and blood vessels to start sending more nutrients our way. They start tricking out the immune system and telling it things that aren't true. They start growing. They start developing, even like turning on more blades of their Swiss Army knife of evolutionary mechanisms. And then when you attack them violently with chemotherapy or radiation, they evolve even faster, because what that does is it causes their evolutionary machinery to switch on. So when you go for chemo or radiation, you are dumping napalm on a Vietnamese village. And if you don't kill everybody in the village, like everybody, if there's a few left over that are upset, well, here's what happens. Your sister-in-law calls you and go, my numbers are looking great. And 5 months later, she's dead. Because the few, that tiny little percentage that were left over, they come back with a vengeance. Because you are fighting the evolutionary machinery that the creationists tell you doesn't exist and that the atheists don't tell you anything about. Because it doesn't fit either one of their neat little story. And one of the reasons that cancer research has been stuck, one of the many, is because the war between the creationists and evolutionists has hid the real story about evolution. You can't understand cancer unless you understand evolution. You can't understand evolution unless you understand cancer. So you said something like, so what could happen in, 5 or 10 or 50 years if what we're doing prevails? So I think you could have a $25 test at Walgreens that you go do every year to find out if you've got stage -1 precancerous cells in your body.
Which are these giant polyploid cells.
Yeah, and there's tiny numbers of them.
Yeah.
They're 100 times the size of a regular blood cell, but there's maybe only a few hundred. And most people would never look for them or find them, but we have ways to find them. So you could have a test and it could tell you, not only do you have stage -1 cells in your blood, they're coming from your kidneys, so you have unhappy kidneys, so we got to figure out what's up. Do you need green tea, meditation, forgiveness, different diet, more exercise, more sunlight, less sunlight?
Different job.
Different job. Can we give you a PET scan every 2 months and watch it like a hawk? Maybe we can cut out that little itty bitty corner. Can we walk this back? I think it's very likely that we will have a way to take those cells out. I don't have time to, we already have ways of marking those cells and painting a red bullseye on them right now. There is a chip that somebody's developed at Columbia that you can insert under the skin that can detect those cells in your body.
Wow.
Michael Levin at Tufts University has done experiments where he induces cancer in amphibians and then gets cancer cells to revert back to normal cells. Yes.
Holy smokes.
Yes. And I think some of that technology could be used to reverse early cancer cells if you catch it early enough. Now, I'm a marketer and I understand why early detection sounds so good, but people don't do it, and it's because it's prevention. I don't know how many consultations I've done with clients where they have a prevention. I'm like, well, could you sell a cure for like 100 times more money and then like eventually figure out how to sell the prevention? Because prevention's hard to sell. If a guy's having a heart attack, like right now, you say, I'll fix your heart attack for $250,000, and the guy will say, sold.
Right.
5 years ago, you couldn't get him to ride an exercise bike. You couldn't get him to stop eating cheeseburgers. And so I think the people in the know need to put less and less and less money towards stage 3 and 4, which is where the bleeding neck is, and put more and more into stage -1, stage 0, and stage 1. And that's why I'm working with the people that I'm working with.
I think you did a pretty good job doing that in 10 minutes.
That's awesome.
That was great.
That's really great. That gives us all hope.
Yes, I am hopeful.
Yeah.
I am hopeful. I think we can do this. I don't think we're lost in the woods with no compass. I think, there's this phrase, if you need a new idea, read an old book. I think there are things that have been discovered 10, 20, 40, 60 years ago that you just plug them into the right place. I don't believe that government, insurance companies, and the medical system all by itself will solve this. And the university won't solve this because they don't have an incentive to. You know who does? I know a lot of people who are really, really sick and tired of the medical system the way that it is. And they're tired of government the way it is. And they're tired of research the way it is. I think, that phrase, amateurs built the ark, professionals built the Titanic. I think that applies here. And I'm not saying that we don't need professionals, because I have some of the best professionals in the entire field. And you can go look up on the Reversing Cancer website and you can see some of them. But it also requires donors who have their heads screwed on straight. It requires entrepreneurs. It requires volunteers. It requires people outside the system, because people inside systems don't fix systems. People outside systems. Google did not come from the search engine industry. ChatGPT did not come from Google. Bill Gates did not come from the mainframe server industry. Uber did not come from the taxi industry. Airbnb did not come from the hotel industry. And the cure for cancer is not going to come from Pfizer or the US government. And I'm excited about what I'm doing because I'm working with the real people and they're doing the real stuff. And if people want to help, there's room for help. And if people want to donate, there's really good uses for that money. So who wants to help?
I love that. Thank you.
Yeah. The last thing is you made it through it. You are a fantastic guest. This was so much fun. Sounds like
You
we've got.
guys did a great job asking
well,
questions.
thank you. So we've got 3 cameras right here. You can pick whichever one you want to go and talk to. And you can either, say anything that you want to say. You can, leave a legacy. You can tell people, like, if there's one thing you need to know, it's like this. It's all yours here. Cameras are all on just for you.
Well, early in the interview, David asked me, so what's your formula for how you solve problems? And I gave him a formula. I think everybody has their formula, and you have your formula. And your number one job is to figure out what your own God-given formula is. And if you're older than about 20 or 25, there's already a history that will tell you what that formula is if you pay close enough attention to it. And I think most people are not conscious enough of their own gifts, their own abilities, the things that they innately do without even trying or without even thinking about it. And I think you need to ask yourself, ask God, ask your friends. One thing that I have a lot of my clients do is I tell them, I'm giving you an assignment, email your friends, tell them that you're doing an assignment for a class. What is my unique capability? What do I do better than almost anybody? And I need your answer by Tuesday. And 10 of your friends email back, well, you know what I think you uniquely do, and you should take that and take it really seriously and sift it and sort it and figure out, that will probably tell you quite a bit about what your formula is. And then you lean harder into that and you say, I'm going to look for jobs, careers, educational opportunities, hobbies that tie into that. I think the innate giftedness of any human being is one of the most marvelous things. And it's not selfish, it's not narcissistic, it's the only way you serve the world. You're not going to serve the world just being another person putting a hubcap on another tire if a robot could do it.
Yep. Well, that's probably the best advice I think could possibly. Sorry, not advice, because we don't like advice here, like wisdom. Very different things. Very different things.
It's in there. It's baked in. It's in your history.
Yeah.
It's in your friends. Guess what? They don't have to wait for your funeral to tell you you're awesome. They could tell you now.
Right.
Yep.
What a countercultural thing is tell people how awesome they are before they're in a casket.
I think with that, we're going to end today's episode.
Right.
So,
Thank you.
So everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. Perry, thanks so much for being a guest. And as always, everyone, remember, stay curious. See ya.